Returning to the first of those two topics that I wanted to get to, which were SETI and parapsychology. So you've already mentioned that you classify SETI as quasi-science, and I'm hoping that you could put some more color on just why the search for extraterrestrial life gets classified between science and pseudoscience. Is it just because it is sort of open-ended and I guess it's unfalsifiable in a sense?
Right. So first of all, it is unfalsifiable. If the statement is there are intelligent civilizations out there, that statement cannot ever be proven false because the universe is essentially infinite, and you would have to search every single nook and cranny in order to falsify that statement. But as I said a few minutes ago, falsifiability by itself, although it's it's still a good guidance. It's still a good idea to keep in mind, because if something is unfalsifiable in principle, then it is problematic. But in and of itself is not sufficient to classify something as a pseudoscience. And as I want to be clear, I do not think that SETI is pseudoscience. I do think, however, it is borderline science. And the reasons I think that is, first of all, because it doesn't really have a lot of a theory behind it. It's kind of an open, as you pointed, it's an open-ended search. Like people point radio telescopes out there and hope for the best. That's not really a particularly sophisticated way of doing science, so to speak. I mean, the SETI supporters will claim that there is a theory, but if you look at what this theory allegedly consists of, you don't really find a lot of meat. The major theoretical bit of the SETI program has always been the so-called Drake equation. Now, first of all, that's bad news right there, because the Drake equation was proposed by Frank Drake back in the 50s. And we're now in the 2020s. If 70 years later, you still think that the major theoretical structure is what it was at the time and nothing really much has happened in between, that means that as a research program, SETI has not really moved that far from its beginning. That's not good news. The other thing is the Drake equation is essentially a list of parameters that influence the probability of discovering or of probability of existence of a technological civilization. Now, some of these parameters have been measured or can be estimated, like the number of stars in the galaxy. That's a relatively easy one. When Drake wrote down the equation, one of the parameters was the number of systems in the galaxy, stellar systems in the galaxy, that have planets. Now, at the time, we only knew of the solar system, our own solar system. So nobody knew what that particular number might look like. But now we have quite a bit of information about extrasolar systems and planets. So we can actually come up with a reasonable estimate, at least in our galactic neighborhood for that number. So things have improved. However, there are other factors or variables in the Drake equation that I have no idea how anybody can possibly think of estimating them. One of them is the likelihood of that once life has arisen on a planet, that life would eventually develop into intelligence. We have no idea how to estimate that number. We know of one case, our own, but that doesn't tell us anything about estimating probabilities on the case of n equal 1. It's not a good way to go. The likelihood of life originating on a planet is also an entirely unknown, as far as we can tell. Again, we know of one case, our own. Now, we may discover relatively soon other cases. So if we do find life on Mars, even fossil life, or if we find life on one of the moons of Jupiter, then we will have more than one case. But at the moment, we don't. And even if we did, we only have a handful of cases. Now, a handful is certainly more than that, better than one, but not much. And then there is other things like the duration of a technological civilization. Well, we don't have even a single case for that because our civilization, thankfully, is still going. We don't know how long it might last. It might end, in a few decades, or it might end in millennia. We have no idea. Or millions of years. We have absolutely no idea. So there are certain numbers in Drake equation that are pretty much impossible to estimate. That's bad news, considering that is the fundamental aspect, theoretical aspect. But there are more subtle problems with SETI. The entire enterprise is implicitly based on the notion that we can universalize, generalize human psychology. I mean, after all, why would other civilizations want to communicate with us? That's because we want to communicate with them. So we assume that they would want to communicate with us. But there's no foundation for that assumption. It's just a projection of human psychology. What kind of guarantees do we have that anybody else other than human beings is actually interested in developing technologies in the first place? I mean, we don't know. We take these things for granted simply because we have done it. But there is no particular reason other than projecting human psychology and human history onto aliens to think that has actually happened anywhere else in the galaxy. It may or may not. I'm not suggesting that it didn't. I'm just saying that the only reason we think so is because we universalize human psychology. So in other words, the SETI project is, in a sense, a big example of a gigantic human ego. We project the way we think across the galaxy, and we say, okay, good, let's find out what these people are doing. I mean, even when SETI researchers try to figure out, okay, how do we communicate? They're always going on the basis of assumptions about human psychology. Oh, surely they'll use mathematics, let's say. Surely? Why would that be the case? Mathematics is human invention. It's not, I don't believe that mathematics is an universal anything. It's a language. It's a human technical language, just like logic. So some other civilizations may or may not hit on the same way of doing things, or may or may not think in the same way. We have absolutely no idea. So all of those are serious problems. And of course, the biggest one of them all is that we have no data. No positive data. We have a lot of negative data, but we have no positive data. Now, of course, this conversation we just had could be rendered completely null and void if the two of us wake up tomorrow morning and read in the New York Times that SETI has discovered, intelligent signals from space, in which case I'll be the first one to open the champagne. I mean, I'll be very happy if that kind of thing happens. But if we're talking about the status of SETI as a science, those are all significant problems. That said, I wouldn't classify SETI as a pseudoscience. I would classify it as a pretty sloppily thought out and not particularly successful quasi-scientific approach. But it's not anything like astrology or creationism or anything like that. SETI researchers are not violating the laws of nature or anything else that we know from science when they point their radio telescopes somewhere.
Do you think that we should not be investing resources in something like SETI? Because it seems to me like even if it's not a rigorous science, it's still a very worthwhile endeavor.
That is another very good question. I don't know. If you asked me that question, 20 years ago, I would have said, of course we should spend the money. Now I'm not so sure. SETI doesn't cost a lot. Broadly speaking, I mean, we're talking about tens to hundreds of millions of dollars a year, which sounds like a lot to maybe you or me, but it's not in the general scheme of things. So maybe you can make that argument. Look, it doesn't cost much, but at the same time, scientific funding is or funding in general of any kind of human activity is a zero-sum game. Unfortunately. We have limited resources. So even if it's not a lot of money, you could still make an argument that maybe $100 million a year should be spent, helping the poor instead of engaging in these kind of things, especially given that we don't really have any idea whatsoever how successful or how likely to be successful this endeavor is. I mean, there are other scientific projects that are far more expensive than SETI, and usually they're justified on the basis of the payoff and the likelihood of that payoff. I mean, I was for years on panels grant panels at the National Science Foundation. And boy, that was always one of the questions asked by the panelists to anybody who wanted money. How likely is it that you're going to succeed on this? It's kind of interesting to me that people don't ask that question for SETI. So.
To take one more concrete example, so I already mentioned Avi Loeb. I spoke with him recently, and he's to recapitulate for those who aren't aware of him, he's an astrophysicist at Harvard, and I think it was in 2017, this comet Oumuamua came into the solar system, and all of the observations made about this comet were scientifically motivated, and they noticed many strange things about it. I think its orbit was off. It had a strange shape, a strange sort of rotation, and all of these things struck Avi as so improbable that he theorizes it to be its origin to be of extraterrestrial life. I think one hypothesis he has is that it's a fragment of some structure called a Dyson sphere, which is a sphere for harnessing the energy from a star, or it can also be a fragment of some sort of spacecraft. And without putting words into your mouth, is my understanding of your position is that while, all of the tools, so to speak, of science make these observations possible, and Avi is an accomplished astrophysicist, these observations don't license the sort of theories that he has about them, and they shouldn't be called science because this object, Oumuamua, is now so far gone, we can never observe it again, capture it, test it, and the theory is just unfalsifiable in that sense.
Right. I think that we're talking about something that, again, it's borderline science, and I don't think that we should be spending too much time on it because, as you say, the object is gone, it's not going to come back, and there is no way to verify or falsify anything that has been said about that. Dyson spheres are entirely hypothetical. We don't know of any of those things to begin with. So now you're trying to explain a mystery by way of an enigma, and it's like, really, this is not normally a good way to proceed in science. Also, my understanding by looking at the literature on that specific topic is that he's in a minority. He's one of the very few who actually takes seriously this kind of possibility. Now, of course, just because somebody's in a minority, that doesn't mean they're wrong. But the history of science is full of people who were in a minoritarian position and it turned out to be right. But it's also full of a lot more examples where minoritarian positions turned out to be, in fact, not a thing. It turned out to be unsustainable. And, we were talking about expertise earlier, and here's the thing. So neither one of us, I don't want to presume in your case, but certainly I am not an astrophysicist. So why am I qualified to talk about this stuff in the first place? My area of interest is pseudoscience in general, but I'm certainly not specifically qualified. If you were to ask me, well, would you want to get into a debate about the specifics of the theory? I would say no. You need another astrophysicist. I can't do it. However, when I looked at the literature, it turns out that the consensus opinion, the majority of experts thinks that was simply a comet, an unusual comet, but a comet nevertheless, not an extraterrestrial object of intelligent origin. That is one of a number of criteria that people who are not experts can and should use when it comes to these kinds of issues. Look at in the following. First of all, is the person who is making the claim himself an expert? In this case, the answer is yes. This is a legitimate scientist from Harvard. If it were not, then I would take that possibility even less seriously than I already do it. But then the next question is, well, what do other scientists think about this thing? What is the consensus? And it turns out the consensus is definitely against the theory in this particular case. Again, that doesn't guarantee that the consensus is right. But, you know, if you have to bet your money, you're going to bet on the scientific consensus, not on the exceptional voice.